Hello everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is just my stupid opinion. We're going to be covering a few things today. Of course, the big story that's come out over the last couple of days is that the FCC has killed net neutrality in the United States, so we'll be discussing that. We're also going to be talking about a report that came out of the Washington Post talking about how Trump has given the CDC a list of forbidden words. We also have new results on Trudeau's approval rating, and for the first time he has dropped below 50% approval rating, so that kind of made my day when I saw that. We also got a trade deal that fell through between China. Trudeau was promising a lot and delivered on nothing, so we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And if we have the time, we'll be discussing about how the Prime Minister office has called in a third party to investigate a accusation of assault. Sexual assault, I should say. But I want to start off talking about the big news today, which is, of course, net neutrality. This has always been a hot button issue for some time. Since Trump's come in office, there have been some questions about whether net neutrality was going to be kept or whether he was going to do away with it. And as it turns out that the Republican-dominated FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and as it turns out, the Republican-dominated FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, ended up voting to end net neutrality. Now, by now, I know most people probably have an understanding of what this is all about. Some still don't. So essentially, as it goes, net neutrality is what we know right now. You can log into any site. You don't have to worry about your speed getting throttled. You don't have to worry about possibly using Netflix when the competition wants you to use Hulu, just as an example. So what net neutrality did is when Obama signed it into legislation back in 2015, I think it was February of 2015, this put the internet underneath Title II. And what Title II in America was, Title II is the part of the Telecommunications Act of 1934. The Telecommunications Act of 1934 is actually what created the FCC, bringing it into existence. And by moving the internet into a Title II, which is considered a utility, that brings it underneath the FCC's regulation. So while it's underneath the Title II regulation, this means that the FCC can regulate it to ensure that internet service providers, ISPs, aren't trying to throttle your speed or prevent you from using certain websites simply because they're not the type of websites they want you to use. A good example of this in Canada would be that Rogers for a while was associated with Show Me. Rogers is the biggest internet company in Canada. So if we didn't have net neutrality here, what could have happened before Show Me went under back in 2016 is that anybody such as myself that has Rogers cable, Rogers internet, and uses Netflix, well, they could throttle your speed so that way Netflix doesn't run that well, encouraging you to drop it and go use Show Me. Or encourage Netflix to pay more in order to be able to run at full speed, to use these fast lanes, as they put it. So before 2015, prior to 2015, when this happened, essentially net neutrality was worked under the honor system when it came to internet service providers, is that it was well known that people didn't want to be throttled. They didn't want to have to pay more to access certain pages. So there were some incidents. A good one was Comcast. They ended up throttling some people's speeds, but this caused a severe lashback. So before, there was no regulation, but by putting it under Title II, what Obama did was make sure that now it was guaranteed that nobody could do this, otherwise they'd be violating FCC rules. And finally, it's worth knowing that the big companies are the ones supporting net neutrality. So Netflix want net neutrality, Google, Amazon, and several other big companies. They want net neutrality. And it's the internet service providers who are against net neutrality. Which kind of, makes sense because this would allow more power to be put into the hands of the internet service providers. Now, people who are against net neutrality, they're saying that this will create a more open market, that the smaller people will be able to compete instead of the market being dominated by the big companies as we know it. And it is true that it is mostly internet service providers that are heavily in support of ending net neutrality. And as I say, it's the big companies that are in favor for it. This is somewhat true in Canada too. While there hasn't been as heavy of a argument about net neutrality, one thing that has been noted is whenever something like this has been brought up, Rogers, the biggest internet provider, they are pro net neutrality, and TELUS and Bell, the two other service providers. Bell would probably be the second largest internet provider in Canada, followed by TELUS. These companies were in favor of ending net neutrality. And people who are against net neutrality are saying by allowing internet service providers to do this, essentially what it's going to do is it's going to put pressure on the big companies. Most of the people that are against net neutrality seem to be against it because of the big corporations that are behind it. So they seem to believe that this will open up the market more for more competition. More people could switch their internet service provider if they're being stifled more. So if you're with, say in Canada, you're with Rogers and you were getting stifled from certain pages, such as Netflix, if Show Me was still around, just as an example, well then Rogers can slow down Netflix. So then if you were unhappy with that and you wanted to keep your Netflix, then you could go to Bell, who then would guarantee, say, that they wouldn't slow you down if you wanted to use Netflix. Now, on top of this, if they ended net neutrality, the other thing is they were supposed to have full disclosure. So they would tell you that this page, for instance, Netflix, while at the same time you can access these ones at a faster rate. A lot of this would have to do, too, whether the big companies want to pay into this, whether they want to pay for the faster rates, the fast lane, as they call it. So personally, I think this would actually be stifling more than opening up the market, because if we're going to end net neutrality, then suddenly money becomes the ultimate speech in this situation. Payment is all that really matters, how much you're going to give them. The big corporations can already afford to dish out the money for in order to get these fast lanes, but it seems to me that these smaller companies wouldn't be able to as much. So even though these people who are against net neutrality say it would open up the market more, when the big corporations like Google, Facebook, Amazon, when they already have all the money and then money becomes ultimate speech, how is the little guy supposed to compete? The whole point of net neutrality is it takes money out of the equation in being that form of speech. Now you can't pay for more, you can't slow things down. This would actually help benefit the little guy from what I can see. The other thing I thought was a little bit interesting about this whole situation is the people that were against net neutrality were on the right, were conservatives or just new right-wingers, whatever. Now, that being said, there's actually a great disparage between even amongst Republicans as to who are pro-net neutrality and who are against it. I actually have the numbers right here. In terms of there was a study done on net neutrality, and people were offered the two arguments. So on the non-neutrality side, so for against net neutrality, they said that the way things are with net neutrality, it has a staggered innovation, and that it's unnecessary, that it never was necessary beforehand, before Obama signed into legislation as a Title II, that this was not a big issue beforehand, so it's not necessary now. They say ISPs should be allowed to charge more if they want for fast lanes, because everything would require full disclosure. And it seemed that only about 48% said that they found the argument was convincing, while 51% found it unconvincing. More Republicans said they found it convincing, 59%, than Democrats, 35%. So yes, there has obviously been more Republicans that were in favor of ending net neutrality, but even that number was quite disparaging. Because if we look at the other side, what the argument was is that from the neutrality side, they say big companies can afford it, smaller companies can't, as in these new fees that were going to be introduced. So yeah, there's that, and we all know the rest of the argument, because most of us out there seem to be against net neutrality. For net neutrality. I am one of them. I actually am in favor of net neutrality. But then when we look at the overall numbers, it says only 16% were in favor of ending net neutrality, while 83% are opposed. Amongst these numbers, who call themselves Republicans, only 21% were in favor of ending net neutrality, while 75% want to keep it in place. 11% of Democrats are in favor of ending net neutrality, and 89% are opposed. They want to keep net neutrality. And independents seem to be in between, with 14% in favor of ending net neutrality and 89% want to keeping net neutrality in place. So the numbers are much more heavily in favor of net neutrality than against it, although there are some that are against it. But again, personally, I don't see the results happening that we're promised if we end net neutrality. They say that it's going to create more competition when you've just made money the ultimate speech and the big guys have all the money. The other thing that surprises me about more of the people being on the right who support ending net neutrality is a lot of them, especially those who work in the media, they complain about how these days they find that conservative voices are being silenced, that they can't really get much of a platform on things like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, that these are all more left-leaning areas. So it's difficult. They get demonetized, they get censored on Facebook or Twitter, just as an example of what they argue many times. I don't see now why they would expect that then they would not get slowed down in a situation like this, because they would have to pay more. So an example is Ben Shapiro from the Daily Wire. He is somebody who's he's in favor of ending net neutrality. He thinks net neutrality is stupid. But then at the same time, if these internet service providers tend to lean more left-wing, which I get a feeling that they do, and they're worried about censorship, why then would these internet service providers not then slow down, say, information to Ben Shapiro? Why would they not slow down the access to the Daily Wire? One more thing is, I feel that with all the politicization of net neutrality over the last couple years, it's going to give more incentives to these internet service providers to actually do this, whether it's throttling speed or, not really giving access to certain websites, whatever it happens to be. I feel like this now would actually probably happen more often, because with the politicization of net neutrality and now the ending of net neutrality, I feel like these companies would then want to take advantage of this, especially if it's been such a hard-fought battle and they were in favor of ending it. So now we really are going to see throttling, increase in fees, and we're going to see certain websites that are going to be slowed down simply because they don't want to dish out the extra money for the fast lane. But this argument has not been quite the same up in Canada. Canada is actually very pro-net neutrality. We have been since pretty much since the internet started. In fact, early this year, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, which is the Canadian FCC equivalent, they actually spoke about strengthening their commitment to net neutrality. So that was nice to see. And a lot of people don't fear that the argument with net neutrality is going to become as fierce up here in Canada, even despite this, because the CRTC is not quite as partisan political as the FCC is. See, the FCC, the commission is appointed by the president. They're allowed to appoint 3 from one party, and then they need to appoint 2 members from the other party. So pretty much whoever is the sitting president will elect 3 of their party and 2 of the other. This is what Obama did. This is what Trump did. So at the moment, the FCC is Republican dominated, 3-2. This is why they were able to kill net neutrality. It was a vote, 3-2. But our CRTC is not quite as political, and it seems that a lot of them base their decisions more on complaints and the evidence lodged against it, rather than about who's in office. And I really am happy to see that, because that means that they're a little more regulated. I found they're a little more realistic too, because we're not going to have these various changing laws like this, like Obama is putting net neutrality in place, Trump is taking net neutrality out. What happens if, let's say, Trump loses the next election, and then the next Democratic president, if it happens to be a Democratic president, wants to reestablish net neutrality? It's all over the place. But in Canada, with it being less political, it's more about what the people want. It's more about how the sentiment of Canadians really are. So most Canadians are pro-net neutrality, therefore the CRTC is actually trying to make sure that net neutrality is solidified in our laws. One reason is that Canada has always treated the internet as underneath the Telecommunications Act. So we've always treated it as a utility, pretty much the way net neutrality worked. We've been doing this from the start. So that's just kind of the way it's always been. and we're just used to it. But that doesn't mean that just because we are pro net neutrality and the CRTC is trying to solidify it, that doesn't mean Canada won't be affected by these recent changes that happened with the FCC by ending net neutrality. A lot of our content is American based, and this means that we'll be trying to get our content through not American internet, we'll get it through our internet, but it will be affected because it is American content. It's possible Netflix fees will go up over this. If they want to pay for the fast lane, well, you got to get the money somewhere. You're probably going to raise your prices by $1, maybe $2 on each customer. America also is one of the biggest creators in general. They have 300 million people living in America. It's one of the most advanced countries in this world, and it's full of creative people. So I actually think this is going to have a very big worldwide impact. How many people rely on TV shows from the States? I mean, shit, how many Canadians are trying to get American Netflix or using American IP addresses in order to get American Netflix? TV shows, movies, art, music, all this comes out of America. So this is disappointing to see. Now, it's possible that not much will come out of this. Maybe the ISP providers don't really take advantage of this. Who knows? But it just seemed that when net neutrality was looking like it was going to be ended, it really looked like the ISP providers were jumping all over this, including some who said that they were dedicated to net neutrality. So let's move on to a different story now. So a story came out of the Washington Post the other day, and it was kind of interesting. Essentially, the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, was given a list of words from the Trump administration that are now forbidden for them to use in the coming year, in 2018. These words couldn't be used in official documents being prepared for next year's budget. And the list of words are vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and science-based. Now, as the article goes on to say, in some instances, the analysis were given alternative phrases. Instead of science-based or evidence-based, the suggested phrase is, quote, CDC based its recommendation on science in consideration with community standards and wishes, end quote, the person said. In other cases, no replacement words were immediately offered. Now, as the article goes on to say, the problem is at the CDC, several offices have responsibility for work that uses some of these words. In the National Center for HIV/AIDS, viral hepatitis, STD, and TB prevention is working on ways to prevent HIV amongst transgender people and reduce health disparities. The CDC's work on birth defects caused by the Zika virus includes research on the developing fetus. So there actually are reasons to use these words, because some of them are actually relevant, such as it said, the transgender one, there it makes sense, and also for fetus. But then let's look at even those last two that they give. The two that in my opinion, are the most dangerous that they are banning. Evidence-based and science-based. Okay. We're starting to stray in a dangerous territory when you're saying that science-based and evidence-based is no longer allowed. Now, yes, they've given an alternative for it, saying that it's... Whoa, let's read that again. What did they say it was? It was, instead of science-based, is CDC bases its recommendation on science in consideration with community standards and wishes. Okay, why I think that's dangerous, first of all, when you say with community standards and wishes, the science is the science. It doesn't matter on the community wishes. And where I think this is most dangerous is actually in the religious community. Because there are those that will reject science based strictly on their religious doctrine. And this is where I think it's most likely going to take effect. This is not even a problem if you want with Christians. It'll also be a problem for those people more on the right if you want with the Muslim population. I feel like this is also going to be an issue. Although, without a doubt, this is clearly based more for the Christians than it would be the Muslim population coming out of Trump's America. It does make me a bit nervous, though, when a sitting president who won their campaign based on decentralized power and rebuilding a corrupt system is now giving a organization whose primary concern is health and medicine and disease, is giving them a list of words that they cannot use anymore. We're getting into a dangerous territory when that's what we're doing. The other thing I find is when you're going to ban words such as science-based and evidence-based, well, then we've really reached an age, if I can use the conservatives' phrase against them, we've really reached an age where it's fiction over fact. Because science is science. I've already stated before that science is very objective in telling us what the world is. If the science is done properly, then there's no circumventing. So when you're willing to essentially allow loopholes for people to circumvent the science, to circumvent the evidence, and evidence doesn't necessarily have to be science-based. Evidence can take place in just about every single part of our life. The business world, you use business models that has evidence of working. You don't just pick a model and run with it. You go with ones that have been proven, that have evidence behind them, that they work. And we even do this sort of thing in our personal lives. Someone wants to make an accusation, they better have evidence behind it. In criminal cases, you have to have the evidence to prosecute somebody. Or at least you're supposed to, but then again, that happens a lot where people get put away for bullshit crimes. The thing is that kind of surprised me in, again, when I say this seems to be the age of fiction over fact, is I was expecting this out of the left for the way that they've been acting these days. I guess I shouldn't be surprised because I find historically the right has been the ones that have wanted to discredit science. Of course, that's not all, but many have been willing to discredit science just because it doesn't fit the narrative, you know? For instance, Christian conservatives, if it goes against their religion, then they're willing to put the science aside. But the one part that really concerns me is because if the president can do this, then it's showing more power that is being given to one person in central command, in central authority. This is something that America was not founded on, it's not based on. The whole point of America was to limit that centralized power to prevent corruption or anything like that. Now, just because he's issued this doesn't actually mean that he's gone full-blown corruption or anything like that. I'm sure there's people who think he was corrupt from the beginning and people still don't think he's corrupt now. I think this is a problem regardless, whatever side you fit on, whether you hate him, whether you love him. Banning these words are showing, in my opinion, him overstepping what his promised role was. Because as I've already stated, he talked about decentralized power, but this is him showing that he's willing to throw his weight around, throw his power around in order to tell others, including reputable organizations, what to do. And I suppose the other reason this kind of concerned me is because I heard very recently Trump wants to rebuild the FBI. Now, FBI over the last few years especially has really not done their job well. I stated before that I've been starting to have some skepticism about this whole Russian collusion case. They also did not handle the Hillary Clinton emails very well. It was very piss poorly done. At first, when I kind of looked into it, I thought maybe they did it well, but the more I looked into it, I realized the more James Comey actually overstepped his role as FBI director. For instance, when he announced an investigation into Hillary Clinton and when he announced that there was nothing for Hillary Clinton. In both situations, it was not his responsibility to do so. And then we recently heard that there were FBI text messages or emails, one of the two that came out, that were very anti-Trump. So clearly we have a problem in the FBI. It's very partisan in this degree. But when I hear Trump say that he wants to rebuild the FBI, even if the FBI should be rebuilt and it needs to be rebuilt more ethically to be sure that they do a better job, this should not be the job of the President of the United States for the same reason I stated earlier. It's about decentralized power. That's what his campaign was on. That's what America's supposed to be founded on. And yet, if he was to rebuild the FBI based on his specifications, I would assume, then it seems to me he would be putting the people that he wants in charge, the people that he wants leading the cause, and the people, and they would probably in turn recruit people that Trump would be in favor for. And it seems to me at that point, we're starting to get almost like a secret police on the go. when we have an organization that is responsible and very in favor of the current president. And if Trump's going to be building it up, if the president's going to be building it up, it just gets even more scarier. It's just more power towards the president, another organization whose power has been given to the president. This sort of move should be concerning regardless of who is in office, whether it's a Republican, whether it's a Democrat, whether it's Trump, whether it's Obama. It should be concerning because, once again, one man has been given all this power, and one man is trying to throw that power around, and one man is trying to take more government organizations into the centralized power. And in some regards, Canada is better, and in some regards, Canada is worse than America for centralized power. See, the Prime Minister can actually be voted out. They're technically the head of their party, but they could actually lose their riding. So a Prime Minister can lose their seat before an election actually happens, before an official election actually happens, a federal election. They can be replaced. I don't even know if it's ever really happened before. But at the same time, there are some regards where the Prime Minister has more authority over his cabinet and his government than the President does. So there are some things that the President has more power over than the Canadian Prime Minister, such as the President can't call for war, but the President can make a tactical strike. Like if they think that they need to call in the military immediately, they can make that decision, but they just can't call for war without Congress's approval. And in Canada, you can't do that. You need to have the official vote. Now, again, I'm pretty sure this doesn't happen. There's plenty of times where there's shady military shit that goes on behind closed door that we don't know about. But the way it's supposed to work is there's supposed to be an official presentation in the House of Commons that there wants to be an act of war, a military action. So I personally think these two moves by Trump are concerning and are overstepping the bounds of where the president should. And I think that if this happened to be Obama who did this, then the right-wingers would be very upset about this, about these sort of moves. However, many are pro-Trump, so they're not really willing to go against their candidate. Hypocrisy is everywhere. Eventually, I'm going to do an episode based on that, about just hypocrisy, because I'm seeing it everywhere, especially as I've watched the transition both from, in Canada, a conservative government into a liberal government over the last 2 years, and in America from a democratic government over the last 8 years into a Republican government. I'm just seeing the big hypocrisy on both sides. And this is actually one thing that's driven me away from partisan politics. I personally am still call myself a liberal, although I'm more about Lockean philosophy when it comes to liberalism these days. Other than that, I really fall on both sides of the spectrum. It's just wherever I think the better move is, or where things are a little more level-headed or fact-based or realistic, that's where I try and aim. I don't always go the right way, but that's as much as I go, that's what I'm trying to do. I guess politically these days, I'm trying to be more of a realist than a partisan political person. But as we move away from Trump and a little more back into the homeland, back into Canada, we are more focusing now on our Prime Minister, Trudeau. A person who many know by now I have no love for. When Trudeau came in the office, I didn't vote for him. I've said that before, but I pretty much take the same approach I did for Trump. I said, let's see what they can do. And I was quickly disappointed by him. I was not expecting great things, but yeah, I was greatly disappointed by Justin Trudeau. And ever since, nothing he's done has ever really impressed me. I can't really think of one good thing that I've actually really approved on that he's done. I find one of his biggest problems is that he promises a lot. He overpromises. The main thing to do when you're in politics is to underpromise. You say, you know what, I think I can get us here, but really you believe you can get us up here. And the reason you do that is because that way, when people see that you've done better than you promised or better than what you expected, then generally they'll look at you more favorably. Justin Trudeau does the opposite, though, which is a terrible idea, because if you're going to promise grand things and then not deliver, people are going to get disappointed. People might be able to take 1 or 2 disappointments when you promise grand things, because, you promise grand things, they don't always work out. But when you continue these sort of promises and you never deliver, people really start to lose their faith in you, like they are now, because this report that came out the other day, it was from the Angus Reid's Institute, and their quarterly analysis showed that Justin Trudeau, for the first time, has dropped below 50% approval rating among Canadians. He currently sits at 49%. So as we take a look here at these statistics, so we can see that for the most part, there's 13% who approve strongly. We have 34% who approve somewhat, 20% who disapprove somewhat, and 29% disapprove strongly. 4% don't know. And as we take a look here at the changes in the demographics over the different provinces, some it's been huge and some have been really small. As we see that he's lost a lot of support over in Quebec, and he's lost a lot of support over in the Atlantic. While the Maritimes don't actually have a lot in the way of voting, they only, I think if I remember correctly, they are only worth about 40 seats overall, the Maritimes. I've said before that I think taking the Maritimes is going to be important for the Conservatives. It's not going to be the defining factor, but taking the Maritimes is going to be important for the Conservatives, because there's a lot of small ridings there, which means that it might be easier to convert this smaller group of people over to conservatism than it would be a greater riding. However, they can't rely on this, because as I said, it's only about 40 ridings. The main ridings are in Ontario and Quebec. That's where most of the points are. So the Conservatives are going to have to win in the GTA, the Grand Toronto area, because that's where the most are. That's where they're going to have to capitalize. But taking the Maritimes will be important because of the small ridings over there. It actually was very liberal during the 2015 election. So to steal that from Justin Trudeau would just be shaving off a little bit extra. As well, Trudeau is losing support all over. Left, right, center. From the old really don't like him, to the young. The young are starting to wake up. The problem is as I've said before in the podcast, is that Trudeau, he ended up taking people when he was running for the leadership election, and when he was doing his running in 2012, before he got in 2013, he ended up capitalizing on a demographic of people that did not really pay attention to the news, pay attention to politics. This means that his liberals could be very friendly in person, win them over, so that way when they go out every 4 years, the one time that they actually pay attention to politics, they'll vote liberal. But then for the rest of the year, they're not paying attention to what Trudeau is doing. And I find that those who are paying attention to what Trudeau is doing really don't like him, for the most part. So it's really nice to see that people are starting to wake up to this problem. Especially, it's really nice to see 2 years before election time that people are really starting to wake up. Now, he's still probably the most popular leader at the moment when you're basing it on the leadership and not the parties. Trudeau is still the most popular leader. I have some numbers just down here. Says the new NDP leader Singh debuts with the approval of 39% of Canadians and the disapproval of 33%. 28% are unsure of him, which kind of makes sense. He only came in office a couple months ago, so some might really not have a beat on him yet. Again, personally, he has not impressed me. Canadians have a slightly less favorable view of Scheer, with 35% approval, 36% disapprove, and 29% are unsure. So Scheer's going to have to bump up his popularity if he's hoping to overtake Trudeau and become prime minister in the next election, because as it stands, even Jagmeet Singh is more popular than he is. I think this might have to do that Andrew Scheer's just very plain. He's very plain looking. Trudeau at least has his smile and his hair going for him. Singh, he's a young man, and I'm sure for some people they think he's a good looking man. And he also has being a minority playing for him, so he can capture the minority vote. So he's popular in that regard. But one thing I've noticed is that both in Scheer's case and Singh's case is that they both have a high percentage of unknowns. 29% are unsure of Scheer, and 28% are unsure of Singh. So there's wiggle room there. Either side would steal from the other if there's still people are unsure about this. This is also probably people that aren't very politically active. So they know Trudeau because Trudeau's been around. He's the prime minister. He's made some headlines. Scheer and Singh really, they made a few headlines here and there, but haven't made too much of a bang since either of them come into leadership of their parties. But the Conservatives are inching along slowly and slowly. They're gaining back little bits of support here and there. There's been recent victories inside of Alberta, which means that probably in the next election that happens, which for Alberta, which, you know what, I think it may even be 2018 when their next provincial election is. I can't quite remember. They may go back to conservatism because right now they're an NDP government. But right now, from the way things are looking, it looks like their leader, Jason Kenney, is going to be the next premier of Alberta. The one problem I think that is going to happen, though, for Justin Trudeau right now, with Singh being elected, to me, he's very cookie cutter NDP, but he's similar to Trudeau in many regards. So I think this is going to split the progressive vote come the next election, having Singh in charge, which means if the Conservatives can have a more unified rally, I suppose, can be more unified, they might be able to overtake him, while the progressive and the liberal left are going to be split between Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh. Especially considering how Trudeau has been in office for 4 years. Some progressives are not going to be happy with them. Some will be happy with them and will want to stick with them. We'll see. For me, I don't actually find that Scheer is necessarily the best leader. I find that he's good during question period at calling out Trudeau. But all in all, he's not the guy that I wanted in office for the Conservatives. He's not the guy that I would want to vote for come the next election in 2019. However, at the moment, if I have to base my decision politically on the parties, I would think I would vote Conservative, which would actually be my first time ever voting Conservative over Liberal or NDP, because I'm not too happy with Jagmeet Singh, and I'm definitely not happy with Trudeau. Again, I wanted to see Mulcair still in charge of the NDP, and that's where probably I would have been split on my vote, whether to go NDP or Conservative. That would also depend on what sort of campaign that Mulcair decided to run. Because in the last election, he attracted me at first, but he started to lose my interest with his Stop Harper campaign. It just seemed to go on and on with... He didn't really introduce anything new in like the last month almost, or 3 weeks of the campaign, so he really lost me in favor. However, I wasn't going to vote Harper because I didn't like Harper. Trudeau did not really gain my vote because I found that I didn't like his economic plan, which would be to go into $9 billion debt over 3 years to stimulate the economy in order to drive us out of debt. I didn't see it working. It seemed like it needed a lot of precision and had to go just perfectly, which the economy never does. So I didn't think it was going to work. And lastly, I found Mulcair took a more centralized position than Trudeau did in the past election. I found there was a bit of a swap, that the NDP actually were more center-left, and the Liberals actually went more to the progressive left. Whether that would be the same campaign that Mulcair ended up running in 2019 had he been in charge, I don't know. But as it stands, I will probably be going for Conservative over anybody else, because I see there's some dangers in the type of policies that want to get pushed by a progressive these days, as I've seen through Trudeau. Trudeau's really changed my opinion politically on certain issues. On top of that, another reason I don't like Trudeau is he's not a good deal maker. He is a terrible deal maker. And unfortunately, he has to be our prime minister in a time when deals and the economy are very important at this moment. We have a renegotiating of NAFTA that's taken place since Donald Trump has come into office, and I've actually avoided talking about NAFTA because there's a lot I don't understand about it. Maybe I'll take a swipe at it someday, but I do know that the deals are not going well with what Canada wants to push. Canada wants to push a progressive trade agenda. The Americans are not interested in that, especially if it's Trump who's leading the charge in these negotiations. He's not interested in a progressive agenda. But Justin Trudeau and his Liberals, they want to push things such as the environment, gender, and like fair wages, all sorts of progressive talking points inside of trade negotiations, and it's not going well anywhere. It actually was one of the things that broke apart our trade talks with China. Not directly. There was more to it than just the progressive agenda, but recently Justin Trudeau has been promising a new trade agreement with China, saying he was going to go there on a 4-day trip and he was going to be giving us results. We're going to have a great trade agreement. Part of this is due to how Trump isn't going to sign on to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and the rest of the nations, I think there's 11 of us left, including Canada, they wanted to make some sort of new Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that was one of the things that having the trade talks with China would have been about. Create a trade with Canada, and then we can make negotiations into a greater TPP talk. Yeah, that did not go well. Not even slightly. Yeah, Canadians knew that things were not really going to go well when the International Trade Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, tried to lower expectations just before Justin Trudeau's plane took off to go to China on this 4-day negotiation for a new trade deal. Yeah, well, right before you leave when others are telling you not to have high hopes, that's the first bad sign. Another bad sign was just before negotiations got started, the Chinese officials ended up blocking Canadian news group from taking pictures of Justin Trudeau and the Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang. They were actually blocked and prevented from taking photos and, recordings of their photo op. It was literally a photo op and they're getting blocked. So, not very good start. And then our next clue was when things ran much longer than expected, and then what was supposed to be a joint news conference between the two leaders turned into independent conferences where only a statement was given. The other thing about this was that this so-called progressive agenda, talking about the environment, gender, and workplace equality, yada yada yada, this seemed to have blindsided the Chinese. From what we heard, it seemed that we already had some form of negotiation worked out, and then Trudeau shows up in China and then just hands this over to him and says, oh yeah, this is included. Not a good idea when you're trying to make deals with people, especially people that you don't have necessarily the strongest foundation of a relationship with. It's not like China and Canada are best buds. At least between America and Canada, the trade talks that are going on for NAFTA, there's some relationship there, so that is probably making things a little bit easier. But with China, we don't really have that same relationship with them. Sure, we have business dealings with them. We've had trade agreements with them in the past. But we don't have a cushy, comfy relationship with them, even if Trudeau would probably like with this communist country. Personally, I'm not opposed to a trade agreement with China. If you want to do a trade agreement, hey, do a trade agreement. Let's take advantage of their booming economy right now, but let's not get too comfy with them because they kind of stand for a lot of things that we don't. So more specifically, in these agreements, what the Chinese were blindsided with in this agreement was labor, environment, gender, and governance, as well as disciplines on state-owned enterprises. While I know that Trudeau and his Liberals would love to be able to add this in, what they've got to realize is that in a country like China, where in some cities the air is so polluted the citizens walk around with masks, where sweatshops pretty much originated from, pushing a progressive agenda is not really going to work too well. In fact, I think it would be much better, instead of trying to work out a trade agreement where then you tell the Chinese how you want them to run their trades and their businesses, which doesn't work too well when you're another country stepping in saying, you need to do it our way. The other country will be like... But anyway, maybe a better idea than that for the West and Canada and businesses is to not send our businesses over to China. Maybe instead we do business at home instead of doing it with China with, sweatshops and child labor that we seem to be so against, but then we turn a blind eye to it. We're totally okay of taking advantage of this, but then we stand there and say, how terrible of this country to do it. Hey, do you like my new iPhone and my new Nikes? So instead, don't send the companies and the jobs over to China where you have problems with the type of labor that they do. Keep the jobs here where you can manage them and make sure that people doing the work are actually being treated fairly, given a fair wage, and are at the appropriate age to actually go in and work. But no, we're just going to keep shipping out companies and our business to China, give them all the money, keep their economy booming, and then trade off them, and during that trade agreement try and work in a progressive agenda. That sounds like we're jumping through so many hoops just a virtue signal. It really does. It really fucking does. In fact, it's not the first time the Canadian progressive agenda has killed trade talks. Because as I said earlier, we're trying to sort of rework the TPP agreement without America involved. Well, there was a conference last month in Vietnam where a lot of these 11 nations came together and they were trying to work out the details of this sort of trade negotiation. And once again, at the last minute, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government throws in a progressive agenda and throws a wrench into the whole mix. Specifically, it was Japan and Australia. They seem to be the most put off by this progressive agenda that was put forward by Canada. And again, as I stated, it was last minute. These were not something that was worked into any other negotiations, and then they just kind of showed up and said, hey, everybody, here you go. How arrogant of us, how arrogant of the Canadian government to show up to trade talks that have at least 11 other nations involved. Well, I guess 10 other nations, including Canada, make 11. But they have at least as many other nations involved, and we show up and just pull a fucking different agenda out of your ass and say, here you go, everybody has to follow that. This is the sort of arrogance that Trudeau has brought to Canada. That he feels that, oh, I'm so sensitive and we're so nice people that everybody should listen to us. It's not the first time that he's tried to put Canada up on a pedestal while offering very little. After the migrant crisis, he takes in about 40,000 refugees, and then he turns around and says, the rest of the world needs to be like Canada during this whole crisis. Meanwhile, France and Germany have taken in a couple million between the two of them or something like that. 3-4 million max, I think. Probably the highest numbers, about 3-4 million of these refugees during the migrant crisis. And again, a lot of them were economic refugees, not actually even Syrian refugees. A large portion of those turned out to not even be from Syria. So in my opinion, these are probably the things that Trudeau should fucking avoid. This progressive agenda that he keeps wanting to push in every single sector of both Canadian life and international life. Because it's not enough that he has to push his social progressive agenda on us, and then his progressive economic agenda on us. He goes around to the other nations and then says, you need to be like us. Nobody needs to be like us. In fact, I don't really want the other nations to be exactly like us, because then it takes away some of the uniqueness that is Canada. Canada, like America, but for different reasons, is a unique country. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very, very proud to live in such a unique country such as Canada. Really, aside from America, is there really another country that is as free as Canada? I don't think so. I can't really think of one. Aside from America, what other country offers the freedoms that we offer? Now, some of those freedoms are being taken away these days. And that is more for the sake of equality, which is dangerous, but that's a whole different story altogether. So, as we move into the final part of our podcast, we're going to be talking about, we're going to go through a few quick stories. So the first one is that as Parliament now has broken for the holiday season, now that Christmas is almost upon us, Bill Morneau ended up making his tax change drop. So as I've talked about it many times before, I know, to the point where probably people are starting to get annoyed with it who watch me on a regular basis. So we've been hearing a lot about this. There's been many problems surrounding this. Many people have been pissed off about this. I don't even own a business and I've been pissed off about this. I guess in some ways it would affect me too, and I'll get in a little bit more into detail about that. But anyway, the main thing that Morneau's tax change was going after was income sprinkling, family spreading money amongst each other, and usually this is done in order to get you give the money to somebody in a lower tax bracket. That way they don't get as much money taxed off of the family wealth, essentially. So anyway, as the finance minister, Bill Morneau, ended up saying, he said the new changes will ensure legitimate contributions to small businesses will still be eligible to receive income from the business. A reasonable test was unveiled last July to determine legitimate contributions, but small business owners and business groups were unhappy with the increase in paperwork. This article came out of the CBC. I didn't like that they said that. They said that they were upset about the increase in paperwork because it wasn't about the paperwork. It's not that they had to file more paperwork and they caused a huge shitstorm because they had more paperwork. The problem is they were targeting a large group of businesses, about 15% of Canadian businesses, saying that these were the tax cheats and the rich fucking people stealing from the poor. They targeted them and said, you need to give more to us. And then all these small business owners, doctors, lawyers, I have problems with lawyers, but you know what, still, small-time business lawyers, and every other group. These people were going to get charged because they were trying to have somebody in the family helping with the family business. Is that such a ridiculous thing? And in one regards where this will affect me is because I've been doing some work with my father recently. And I've been getting paid through him. He's getting paid, he cashes the money, he gives me my share. The work is not where we're doing it all the time. It's usually once or twice on weekends, maybe once every second weekend, roughly. At least for me, it's about once every second weekend. So I'm not doing it very much. But now, because my father and I are working for essentially the same employer, and my father, who's done this for some time, and who actually has worked his way up in this small company, and is now sort of, if you want, my boss in this whole situation. Actually, not if you want, he is my boss in this situation. Because of this, the money that he gives me is now considered income sprinkling and can be taxed. I mean, it already can. This is something that we've sort of, we talked about last year when we did this sort of work, is that he ended up taking the money so that he took the hit on the taxes for me, which I told him, you might as well do it the other way around considering I'm in a lower tax bracket. But we're not talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're not even talking about thousands of dollars. We're talking about a few $100s. But this was the sort of thing that they were talking about going after. Now, in my situation, it's only a few $100s because we weren't very active in this, or at least I'm not. It was only like a weekend job every now and then. But if we were doing this as our full-time employment, if this was a business that him and I had started up and we were working in it 5 days a week, at least 8 hours a day, then they were saying that this was unfair. That because I would have been working with my father, and he's paying me, he's actually trying to cheat the system, and I'm trying to cheat the system, and that we needed to pay our fair share. Meanwhile, we have Bill fucking Morneau and plenty of other rich fucking fat cats sitting in Parliament, or at least well associated with Parliament, who aren't getting targeted by this, and the Liberals are saying, look how terrible you middle class people are. In fact, one of the things the Liberals fucking ran on in their 2015 platform was the limiting middle class. They're saying, oh, the middle class is shrinking. We need to focus on the middle class. Well, now they're actually targeting middle class employees and businesses. Well done, guys. Well fucking done. These changes that have been made that are now been introduced as the new tax change on income sprinkling, they say now no reasonableness test will be needed for family members if a spouse is over 65 years old. If someone is over 18 who makes a substantial labor contribution of at least 20 hours per week. Over 25 who own 10% or more of the business that earns less than 90% of its income from the provision of services. So these are the sort of things he's offering. And again, they've said stuff like if you contribute at least 20 hours per week, they'll say that you won't get hit by this as long as you're over 18. Because one of the concerns that the government was saying is that children who were underage were giving these sums of money. I don't know how often that happened. It probably is likely that it did happen. But they're acting like this is actually something that everybody does. That everybody gives their underage kid a shit ton of money in order to hide from the tax man. And then we can take the situation that I have with my dad right now. The type of work that we're doing does not ask for 20 hours a week from us. It only requires maybe 5 out of the whole weekend if we're working both days. But now we would be one of the people that would get targeted by this, even though we're barely doing a job. I'm just doing a job with my dad that my dad has taught me to do. It's awesome. It's a good time. But now they're saying that we're part of the tax cheats too. And you know it was not going to be a good idea when, even before Morneau had opened his mouth, the Senate Finance Committee called on him to put his proposal changes to the Income Tax Act on hold and undertake a full review of the law. This is according to the Toronto Sun. According to Senator Elizabeth Marshall, a Newfoundland Tory and chartered accountant, the Liberals have failed to do their homework on the tax proposal and have no idea of the potential impact Morneau's changes will have. So they want Morneau to hit the pause button. I think it's pretty obvious that the Liberals haven't done their homework because this has been a piss poor job that they have done. And they should hit the pause button. But Morneau still made his drop the tax change, and he's saying that these will take effect in the 2018 tax year. So the Liberals are not going to listen to anybody but themselves, it seems. And these changes are affecting not even necessarily the biggest contributors, but they'll just affect regular families. Even though the Liberals ran on a campaign of it going after the 1% and then the dwindling middle class, now instead they're taxing the middle class and dwindling it even more. And I gotta say, I'm getting really tired of hearing the Liberals and the rest of them playing the moral high ground. Especially, I got really fucking tired of it once this story that came out of the Globe and Mail. No, this one was CBC. It was that apparently the Prime Minister's office is under investigation right now. It says Ruben Tomlinson, LLP, is an independent third party handling the investigation into Claude-Éric Gagné, the Deputy Director of Operations within the Prime Minister's office. Gagné has been placed on leave. Janice Rubin, who led the independent investigation into the Canadian Broadcast Corporation following the dismissal of radio host Jian Ghomeshi, is a partner of the firm. However, a spokesperson for the PMO refused to say if Rubin was directly involved with the investigation. Those who don't know probably are American friends who might be watching this. Jian Ghomeshi was a host of a radio show on the CBC, Canada's largest broadcasting corporation, called Q. And in this, Jian Ghomeshi he called himself a male feminist. He spoke with the very traditional, soft-speaking radio voice. So what ended up happening is, especially he had in the past at least a few times, had gotten into debates with somebody over certain issues, especially involving women's rights or this, that, or the other. And then it came out that he was actually getting a lot rougher with his partners during sex. Essentially, what was happening is they would get invited over, they would go back to his place, and they'd start getting intimate, and then out of nowhere he would start choking them, he would start slapping them. He was really into rough sex and stuff like that, which is, hey, if you're into rough sex, fine, you're into rough sex. But the point is these women had no idea, and then he would just start smacking them around or choking them to almost the point of passing out as he fucked them. So these literally were coming out of nowhere. These were sexual abuses, and it turned out to be true. So this is what they're talking about. This is the person, or at least the firm, that they put in charge in investigating the Prime Minister's office. And for anybody who didn't know, the Jian Ghomeshi case, which went down in 2014, 2015 roughly, was a big fucking deal in Canada. Jian Ghomeshi was well known. Q was a well-liked and listened to show, and this was just holy shit all around for a lot of people. And in my opinion, it was the beginning of the exposure of the male feminist for what they really are. For the people who call themselves male feminist, a lot of them are wolves in sheep's clothing. In fact, one of the best thing I ever heard, the best comparison I ever heard, is there's a fish that actually what they do is they can pretend to be a different gender, pretend that they're female, in order to get in close amongst all the dominant alpha male fish. And then when it secretly merges its way in with the females, it would fuck them and impregnate them. You know, that was the way it was. It was a sneaky fucking fish. The whole point was to sneak by the males, get the women's trust, essentially, in whatever fish terms that is, and then fuck them. And this is the best equivalent I've seen to a male feminist. Most male feminists who are overtly like, I am a male feminist, like Justin Trudeau sort of thing, they have dark fucking secrets that they are holding. They actually have some anti-women beliefs and feelings that they don't expose to the world. But going back to this allegation, it says the Prime Minister's office refused to identify the staffer involved or provide any details of the allegation, but a source previously confirmed that to CBC News that they are against Gagne and involved allegations of inappropriate behavior. Gagne said he takes the situation seriously and has offered his full and complete collaboration with the investigators, who said that he has given him the opportunity to, quote, explain my version of the facts in light of these allegations, which I dispute, end quote. So I just thought, in a sense, this was just too perfect. That we've been, for the last 2 years, had a feminist prime minister and a feminist government that have pretty much told everybody else how terrible they are, and you know how terrible men are, blah 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 blah. And then it just turns out, as we start peeking behind the curtain, it's no fucking better. It's no fucking better. There's inappropriate behavior, sexual abuse, but then the liberals are always the first one to point the finger and say sexist, racist, misogynist, whatever. There's a conservative MP right now who got into trouble. There was an investigation, and eventually the charges were dropped, even though the female Liberal MP was very upset by this, because what ended up happening is back in July, I think it was, there was a photo op between the male MP, James Beeson. He was doing a photo op with the Liberal MP, who is MP Sherry Romanado, and they were doing a photo op with an unnamed veteran. And as they were all squeezing in together for the photo, this conservative MP's terrible crime was telling a joke in which he said, "Not my idea of a threesome." Yeah, and then there was a 7-month investigation into sexual allegations. What was the actual thing? It was sexual harassment allegations against them that were eventually dropped, and the Liberals weren't happy about it. But all he did was make a joke about, it's not my idea of a threesome, and that's all it was meant to do. It was meant to draw laughs. It is in no way intended as an actual harassment in any way. But the other problem was that I found is this Liberal MP afterwards said that she felt uncomfortable going to work because of this. First off, 2 reasons why I think that's bullshit, that she should feel threatened about going to work after that is, first off, it's a fucking joke. So if you can't take a goddamn joke, then maybe you shouldn't be in politics because you might be a little bit too sensitive for something like that. And number two, he's a conservative MP. Even if there are times you will have to cross paths with him, the majority of your time will not be spent around him. It's not like she goes and it is her boss that did this. This is a Liberal MP that is a Conservative MP. So yes, their paths will cross in the House of Commons sometimes. But she's acting like she has to go into work for this guy after, and it's these terrible, terrible things that he's done to her when he made a joke. And I get the feeling that with this coming out, we're suddenly going to hear of several Liberal MPs that are like, we are actually have committed sexual assault. I think it's going to happen because this is the political party that's taken the moral high ground. And the problem with taking the moral high ground, especially when you do it all the time, is that eventually you get knocked off that hill. And when you get knocked off that hill, you fall really fucking hard. Because you've stood up there and you've preached to everyone else about how they should be more like you, about how terrible they are for acting a certain way, and how good you are because you act another way. And then it turns out that, actually, behind everything, you're a disgusting human being. Because the most recent two allegations of sexual harassment that I've seen come out of the Conservative Party recently has been this one where the MP made the joke, and then another one where an MP made a joke. And what it was at a convention honoring women for their work in Parliament, I'm pretty sure, or just government. And in this, the MP ended up making a joke towards the MP and saying, during the ceremony where he's recognizing her, he said to her, it's like nice shoes. It's good to see that you dressed up for once or something like that. To me, again, when I heard this, and I even spoke to my wife about this, we both were kind of on the same ground. This seems to be more of an inside joke between two people that kind of know each other. This is probably what ended up happening over the fact that it was actually him making a sexist remark. And really, if we're going to pick our battles about sexual assault and sexist remarks, can't we do a little bit better than commenting on somebody's shoes? Can't we do a little bit better than a joke made in passing? Are there not real crimes out there that we can focus on? Justin Trudeau and his Liberals were trying to get female genital mutilation taken out of the Canadian Citizenship Guide, thereby making it they would take it out from underneath being listed as a barbaric practice. Seems like these days it's just all about the little things people say, but we're letting all the big things pass by. Alright, I think I've rambled on for long enough for one day. So I want to thank you all for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is Just My Stupid Opinion, and I'll see you all soon.